Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text.
Welcome to this deep dive study session. If you're listening right now, consider this your personalized, one-on-one clinical tutoring session.
Yeah, we're talking directly to you, the advanced practice nursing student.
Exactly. Because usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of clinical precision, right? A patient breaks their arm, you order an x-ray, and there's a jagged white line right there on the screen.
Right, broken or not broken, you cast it, monitor it, and move on. We naturally gravitate toward that kind of visible binary pathology.
But the moment you step into the world of reproductive health, that binary comfort just completely vanishes.
Oh, totally.
You're suddenly looking at a diagnostic landscape that is heavily systemic, deeply personal, and sometimes, incredibly murky. So our mission today is to master the central concepts of Chapter 47.
Which covers common reproductive system issues.
Right, and we're going to walk through the chapter in its exact order: contraception, fertility, PMS and PMDD, and menopause. So your mental map perfectly matches the textbook.
But right off the bat, before we even touch a clinical algorithm, we need to establish a foundational baseline. And that comes down to trust.
Because you're taking a highly sensitive, intimate history.
Exactly.
Okay.
If you haven't established an open, trusting relationship from the moment you walk into that exam room, you're just not going to get the accurate history you need to provide safe care.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And it's also vital to note that the textbook uses the terms female patient and male patient inclusively. So this explicitly encompasses transgender, non-binary, or transitioning individuals. Establishing that framework is step one in patient care.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting at the baseline of patient agency, which is contraception. Because before we talk about treating reproductive issues, we have to understand how we empower patients to manage their own fertility safely.
And that requires rigorous risk stratification. We rely heavily on the CDC's U.S. medical eligibility criteria, or the MEC.
Right, the MEC. I like to think of this as a traffic light system. It breaks down into categories 1 through 4.
Yeah, the traffic light analogy is perfect. Category 1 is your green light.
Meaning absolutely no restrictions for that specific contraceptive method, right?
Exactly. Then category 2 is like a yellow-green. The advantages generally outweigh the theoretical or proven risks.
But then category 3 requires a serious clinical pause. That's your yellow-red light, where the risks of using the method actually outweigh the benefits.
Right, so that requires intensive justification to prescribe. And finally, category 4 is a hard red light. Unacceptable health risks. You do not prescribe it.
And while you're assessing that eligibility, you're inherently evaluating their overall reproductive timeline.
Oh, for sure. Cervical cancer screening is a prime example of that. We have to match our interventions to the patient's physiological age.
Right. So for average risk patients aged 21 to 29, the strict algorithm is a standard Pap test, cervical cytology every 3 years. But notice there is no HPV testing recommended there.
None at all.
Which I always find so interesting, so I have to ask why. I mean, if HPV causes cervical cancer, why aren't we screening for it in 24-year-olds?
I get that question a lot. It's because transient HPV infections are ubiquitous in that age group.
Like almost everyone has it.
Yeah, pretty much. But the vast majority of these infections will clear entirely on their own, thanks to a robust immune response.
Oh, wow.
So if you test for HPV in patients under 30, you're going to get a massive number of positive results that just lead to unnecessary colposcopies and biopsies.
And that can cause cervical scarring, right? Which impacts future pregnancies.
Exactly. But once a patient hits 30, that physiological profile changes. From age 30 to 65, the immune system is less likely to clear the virus spontaneously.
So the protocol shifts. Age 30 to 65, you do a Pap test plus HPV co-testing every 5 years, or you can just opt for the Pap test alone every 3 years.
Right. You adjust the surveillance as the biological risks evolve.
Speaking of biological risks, I really want to talk about the adolescent population. Why are adolescents so prone to contraceptive non-adherence or risk-taking behaviors?
It's actually fascinating. It's entirely neurological. It comes down to the asymmetrical maturation of the adolescent brain.
Okay, break that down for me.
So the limbic system, which is the emotional, impulse-driven center of the brain, matures very early.
But the prefrontal cortex doesn't.
Exactly. The prefrontal cortex governs long-term planning and decision-making. And that isn't fully developed until age 25. Plus, dopamine pathways are hyperactivated during adolescence.
So you basically have a patient whose neurological accelerator is pressed all the way to the floor, but their biological brakes are still on back order.
Yes, that is the perfect way to phrase it. And that is the exact clinical rationale for recommending long-acting reversible contraceptives, or LARCs, for teens.
Things like IUDs and implants.
Right. By removing the daily adherence barrier of a pill, you just bypass that immature prefrontal cortex entirely.
So let's get into the methods and mechanisms of those IUDs. We have two main ones, right? The levonorgestrel ones and the copper T380A.
Correct. And the timing of insertion really matters here. If you insert a levonorgestrel IUD within the first 7 days of a patient's menses, they're immediately protected.
But if it's inserted after day 7...
then they need a 7-day backup contraceptive while the progestin actually alters the cervical mucus. But the copper IUD is totally different. No backup needed, ever, regardless of the cycle day.
That's a huge distinction, and patients will always ask how these devices actually stop pregnancy.
They will, and you need to explain it clearly. Both types of IUDs inhibit sperm capacitation and transport.
Let's do a quick science review. Capacitation is that physiological change sperm have to undergo to actually penetrate an ovum, right?
Exactly. And the copper ions also create a sterile inflammatory response that is highly toxic to sperm.
Which is such a vital piece of patient education. An IUD is not an abortifacient.
Right. It does not disrupt an existing pregnancy. It literally stops the gametes from ever joining.
Okay, so contrast that with oral contraceptive pills, the combined OCPs. How do those actually stop pregnancy?
It's a dual-action endocrine blockade. The estrogen in the pill suppresses follicle-stimulating hormone, or FSH.
And without FSH, no dominant follicle ever emerges from the ovary.
Exactly. And simultaneously, the progestin slows ovum transport and creates thick, hostile cervical mucus,
turning the cervix into a fortress. But introducing synthetic hormones systemically comes with serious safety red flags. We have to circle back to your category 4 contraindications.
Yes, absolutely. You cannot prescribe combined OCPs to patients with current breast cancer or those who are less than 21 days postpartum.
Because pregnancy induces a hypercoagulable state. Adding synthetic estrogen spikes their DVT risk to an unacceptable level.
Which is why a personal history of DVT is also category 4. You also cannot prescribe them for severe cirrhosis.
Because the liver handles the metabolism of those hormones. What about migraines?
A history of migraine with aura is a hard stop. Same with having diabetes for more than 20 years. Those carry compounded risks of severe microvascular damage and ischemic stroke.
Wow. Okay, so we've talked about family planning and preventing pregnancy. But what happens when the biological mechanisms fail to achieve a desired pregnancy?
Now we're moving into section 2, dealing with fertility problems.
Right. And the definition of infertility is tightly bound to age, isn't it?
It is. For a female patient under 35, infertility is defined as the failure to achieve pregnancy after 12 months of regular, unprotected intercourse.
But then if the patient is 35 or older, that window drops to just 6 months. Why the sudden drop from a year to just 6 months at age 35?
Because of ovarian reserve. After age 37, there's a rapid increase in follicular atresia.
Which is the natural death of those ovarian follicles.
Right. If you wait a full year to evaluate a 36-year-old, you're squandering what little viable follicular reserve they have left. You need faster intervention.
I always compare achieving pregnancy to a really complex delivery system. You need healthy cargo, so the sperm and ovum. You need an open highway, meaning patent fallopian tubes and vas deferens. And you need a welcoming destination, the prepared endometrium.
I love that analogy. And breakdowns can happen at any of those steps.
Let's break down the causes. Female factors include tubal issues, like pelvic inflammatory disease or hydrosalpinges.
Yeah, and endometriosis is a huge factor, plus luteal-phase defects. But male factors are implicated in a massive number of cases.
Right, up to 80% of male cases stem directly from testicular defects.
Plus pretesticular issues or post-testicular obstructions like retrograde ejaculation.
Which is exactly why the diagnostic reasoning in Table 47.1 mandates that a semen analysis is the absolute first step before any invasive female testing.
Yes, it is non-invasive and inexpensive, and the normal parameters are highly specific. A normal count is between 40 and 300 million per milliliter.
And anything under 15 million indicates infertility.
Right. Total motility has to be greater than 40%. But the morphology stat is what surprises people.
Oh, the size and shape of the sperm.
Yeah. Only 4 to 14% of the sperm need to have a normal appearance to be considered a normal sample.
Wait, really? So 85% can be abnormal and that's totally fine?
Yep. Spermatogenesis is a high-volume, low-precision process.
That's wild. Now, if the semen analysis is clear, we move to female testing, basal body temperature charting, and day 3 FSH levels.
And a day 3 FSH under 15 IU per milliliter generally suggests an adequate ovarian reserve.
And we also use hysterosalpingograms to make sure those fallopian tubes are actually open.
Exactly. And throughout all of this management and collaboration, we have to look at lifestyle changes. Evidence-based protocols require limiting female caffeine intake to less than 250 milligrams a day.
And alcohol to less than 4 drinks per week.
Right. But we also have to emphasize the psychological toll here. As an advanced practice student, you need to refer patients to Resolve for support group advocacy.
Absolutely. Okay, moving on to section 3. We've looked at the goals of the menstrual cycle, pregnancy, or contraception. But what happens when the natural hormonal shifts of the cycle themselves cause systemic distress?
Now we are talking about premenstrual syndrome, PMS, and premenstrual dysphoric disorder, PMDD.
And the absolute key to diagnosing PMS is timing.
Timing is everything. Symptoms must occur only during the post-ovulatory luteal phase, and they have to resolve 1 to 3 days after menses starts.
It's like being a detective building a timeline. The textbook mandates a 3-month symptom diary.
Right, to prove a 30% increase in symptom intensity in the 6 days prior to menses.
But the differential diagnosis here is tricky. There's a massive clinical red flag.
There is. Nearly 80% of patients diagnosed with PMS actually have a lifetime incidence of psychiatric disorders.
Wow. So if symptoms appear during the preovulatory follicular phase, you have to rule out depression, bipolar disorder, or even endocrine issues like thyroid dysfunction.
Exactly. The timeline is what protects you from a misdiagnosis.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. The evidence-based management. Complex carbohydrates are actually a first-line treatment.
Yeah, because they may increase serotonergic activity in the brain.
Hacking serotonin with carbs, I love it. What about pharmacology?
SSRIs are first-line agents, and uniquely, they can be given only during the luteal phase.
Which saves money and limits systemic side effects, right?
Exactly. For physical pain, we use NSAIDs like naproxen, 500 milligrams twice daily.
And for the severe bloating?
Spironolactone, 100 milligrams. And combination OCPs are actually a second-line treatment here, but specifically ones containing drospirenone and ethinyl estradiol.
Because drospirenone actively reduces that water retention. Okay, so finally, in section 4, we follow the reproductive timeline to its natural conclusion, menopause.
The permanent cessation of menses and ovarian function. Pathologically, it is diagnosed as 12 consecutive months of amenorrhea.
Now wait, I have a question about the diagnosis. If menopause is the loss of ovarian follicular function and a drop in estrogen, why do we diagnose it by looking for elevated FSH levels? Shouldn't hormone levels be low?
It's a great question. It's the feedback loop. Because the ovaries are no longer producing estrogen, the pituitary gland screams louder.
Oh, trying to get a response.
Exactly. It's pumping out FSH greater than 40 IU per milliliter, trying to stimulate follicles that just are no longer responding.
And that drop in estrogen drives the clinical presentation, vasomotor symptoms, right?
Yeah.
Hot flashes affecting more than 80% of patients due to thermoregulatory dysfunction.
Plus vaginal atrophy, so decreased rugae and thinning epithelium, and severe sleep disturbances.
And for management, lifestyle changes are huge. Aerobic exercise reduces hot flashes by 50%.
That is massive. Pharmacologically, we have hormone therapy, or HT, and SSRIs, or SNRIs.
But there's also the tissue-selective estrogen complex, DOAV, which is basedoxifene plus conjugated estrogen.
Right, and the brilliance of DOAV is that it protects the uterus without needing a progestin.
If we connect this to the bigger picture... wait, sorry, that's your line.
Yes it is. If we connect this to the bigger picture, I have to issue a critical clinical safety warning. Any abnormal bleeding in a postmenopausal patient requires a pelvic ultrasound.
Non-negotiable.
It's absolutely non-negotiable. A normal postmenopausal endometrial stripe must be less than 4 millimeters thick.
Less than 4 millimeter.
Anything over that requires an immediate workup for hyperplasia or carcinoma.
Burn that less than 4 millimeters into your memory. Okay, we've covered a massive amount of pathophysiology today, but I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder.
Always a good idea.
Consider how the role of the advanced practice nurse shifts across a patient's lifespan.
Oh, that's a really good point.
You move from compensating for the immature prefrontal cortex of a teenager navigating contraception to playing medical detective during the luteal phase of a 30-year-old, all the way to carefully monitoring the exact millimeter thickness of a postmenopausal endometrium.
Reproductive health really isn't just a system. It's a lifelong timeline of highly specific, evolving care.
Exactly. It's an incredible field. So keep pushing your clinical reasoning. And on behalf of the Last Minute Lecture team, thank you for studying with us today.